London newsagents.
Lord Owen, thank you so much for being with us. There is so much to talk about, not only about your astonishing and long political career, but obviously about the state of the world at the moment. And even in just 2024, in terms of foreign policy, barely a day goes by when another hotspot doesn't seem to get a little bit hotter and the world seems to call a bit closer. I thought we could start by trying to bring the two things together, really, in a way. I mean, when you became Foreign Secretary back in the late 70s, 77, I think it was, you were, when I think about that world now, not long after the Vietnam War had just ended, it seems like such a completely different world. I just wondered if you could sort of give a sense of what the world was like then, and whether you see any echoes now, and whether there are any similarities with today's politicians in terms of the challenges they're facing.
Well, one of the most interesting things, I think, looking back, is that I was the first Foreign Secretary to ever visit Israel.
Is that right?
Yes, I did it in 1978. And it had been, I think, largely because the Foreign Office had their nose put out of joint, really, with the whole of Palestine, and British Foreign Office felt rather bruised by the whole issue. It was always dealt with by junior ministers. But it, for me, was a very interesting country, and I always believed that we were underrating its economic strength and therefore its potential military strength and political strength.
And who was Prime Minister then? Was it Rabin at that time?
I think it was Begin.
Yes. Astonishing. I had no idea you were the first to visit then. It's because of the sort of hangover of what happened with the mandate and Britain's responsibility at that time.
I was very interested in it and had been only a few years before on an extensive tour around Israel. And so they made an investment in me and showed me everything. And the other factor was my wife was a literary agent, and an author called Amos Oz was one of her main authors, and we knew his family. So we went and rather shocked the Foreign Office by staying on the kibbutz for a while.
Oh, really? That must have sent a shock for your officials.
Yeah. So I study Israel, and of course it's massively in the news at the moment with Netanyahu.
What are your thoughts on the current conflict?
Well, I'm rather glad that Netanyahu's broken ground now and said he will never accept Gaza or a Palestinian state. And I think that the world has to confront that if Israel wants to go on electing Netanyahu, then there is no real common ground, and they are going to have to be roughed up. And we have to be strong enough to do that and run the risk of being thought to be anti-Jewish. And I'm not in the slightest bit, and every element in my political life has been to uphold the right of all groups throughout society to be treated equally and not prejudiced. So I've never had any problem with this issue. I know where I stand. I'm totally and absolutely in favour of Israel's right to exist, and I'm also in favour of the huge contribution to the world that the Jewish people have made.
But you think that nonetheless Britain and the United States and Western powers, if Netanyahu remains in office or governments of his hue remain in office and continue with that policy to believe that there should not be a Palestinian state, you think that we should be more aggressive with Israel?
I think we've got to tell Israel quite straight out that what's happening in Gaza is unacceptable and can't continue. Take, for instance, the tunnels. It's perfectly reasonable for the Israelis, which are on the ground in Gaza, to take out these tunnels. They were obviously a threat, and they should be destroyed. I only ask myself, why haven't they focused on that already? And bombing, I don't think, is the best way of destroying tunnels. They've got to go in and put explosives in the tunnels and blow them up. And they've every right to do that. What they don't have the right to do is to bomb indiscriminately an urban economy, an urban city like Gaza, day after day after day, creating a absolutely ghastly humanitarian crisis, and we've got to do something about this. And only in the House of Commons a few days ago, I raised it with the Foreign Secretary, and I've been advocating for quite some time that you will only get the numbers of lorries with humanitarian aid through up if you have a UN protection force. And it happens that when I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the winter of 1992, we were faced with a humanitarian crisis in the mountains. We couldn't get aid through because Serbs were stopping the lorries. And we got a resolution through the Security Council to create a United Nations protection force. Fortunately, too, one was already established in Croatia, and we got a resolution through in the Security Council that for humanitarian purposes, this UNPROFOR force would move into Bosnia-Herzegovina. And within days, it made a huge difference to the humanitarian crisis. Now, I've been pushing for over 2 months the UN Secretary-General to do this, and I raised it again in the House of Commons with David Cameron, now in the House of Lords as Foreign Secretary, and he showed some interest in it a few days ago. I only hope he does it. Humanitarian aid without any form of protection can't get through. I mean, we have 150 lorries, and I think the Foreign Secretary said we need 500 lorries a day into Gaza. This is an emergency, and everybody's sitting on their duff doing nothing. And I'm absolutely furious about it, quite honestly. And I've written even to the UN Secretary-General himself, warning him that this was going to occur over 2 months ago, and saying, prepare for an UNPROFOR force. And the UNPROFOR forces that come in with a measure of agreement. I mean, whoever is the military head of it has to be acceptable, for example, to Israel.
What do you think of the British government's response so far in terms of the international calls for a ceasefire, which the British government have not so far?
Well, I think you go on calling for a ceasefire. But when you can see it's not coming, you've got to have another policy. Everybody's in favour of a ceasefire, but it isn't going to happen. And if it does happen, it's a miracle, and let's bless it. But you must work on the process that something's got to be done to get lorries through, 500 lorries a day instead of 150 lorries. And that will not happen unless they are driven with an escort, front and back, with UN troops on it. And some of those troops will come from Arab countries too, like Egypt.
But do you think that the British government is doing enough even on that score?
No. I mean, I've written to the former Foreign Secretary. I got no response. I was rather more hopeful. Cameron's response in the House of Lords, which is a place, of course, it's farce, but I occasionally go to when something is important, and this was important. And having him actually, the Foreign Secretary there, answering is given rather a boost to the dear old House of Lords.
What do you make of the fact that Cameron is now Foreign Secretary? I mean, do you think it's helpful having a former Prime Minister as Foreign Secretary? I mean, from
his friends say he was bored and suddenly asked to go back.
Is that a good reason to be made Foreign Secretary?
Well, it may be. I mean, I think he comes in where this government needs a new boost. And he comes in with the credibility of somebody who knows a lot of these people around the world and has worked with them around the world. So he comes in with quite a lot of clout.
Do you think his foreign policy was terribly successful when he was Prime Minister?
No, it was lousy. No, terrible mistakes were made in over many areas of policy, in my view, during that period.
Well, isn't that failing upwards, rather, or sort of slightly downwards?
It's a traditional British way of failing upwards.
I suppose so. A bit depressing, though.
Let's give him a chance. He's an able man. If he can get himself engaged, he can be powerful. I
mean, lots of MPs are pretty irritated about the fact that we've got a Foreign Secretary in the Lords now. You were Foreign Secretary in the Commons. Do you think it's appropriate?
No, of course it's not. You shouldn't have a House of Lords. A House of Lords is an absurdity. You can't be a legislative chamber when you're not elected.
But you are a member yourself, of course.
Of course, yes.
Since
but
92.
I was asked to go there after I had finished. So I thought it was a good way of exiting from British politics, really.
What, by taking a place in the legislature?
Well, I was off to the Balkans when I spent 2.5 bloody years, and they were bloody years. Yes. And I was asked by John Major if I would go into the House of Lords, and I accepted it.
How worried?
You see, you can't vote in a general election.
No.
It's a great advantage. So when people ask me how am I going to vote, I say I haven't got a vote.
Yes.
I don't want to be a party person at the moment. But I think the House of Lords should reflect a different type of person who is elected.
And I want to come back to British politics, but since we were talking about the Middle East, how worried are you about further escalation? I mean, we've seen what's happened just this week with Iran and Pakistan. We've seen what's been happening in Yemen with the Houthis and British-American allied attacks there. It feels very, very dangerous at the moment.
It is dangerous. Gaza is having a very strange effect. And I think what the Houthi are doing in interference with shipping in the Red Sea has got nothing to do with Gaza. And if they're doing it in order to influence Gaza, I think they will actually damage their own cause. So I would tell them to get out of that and stop legitimizing it. But who's really behind it? It's Iran. And Iran is creating trouble in many
Most roads do seem to lead back to Iran at the moment,
yes,
don't they?
Aided these days by a much improved relationship with Russia and probably building quietly quite a good relationship with China. So Iran is a very complex and difficult country. I mean, as Foreign Secretary, of course, the whole thing blew up and we lost the Shah. And I remember being told, what a great thing this was going to be for human rights. And I said,
when the Shah fell.
When the Shah fell, and I remember saying on television, somewhat too bluntly, what's coming is going to be a damn sight worse on human rights than even the Shah. And so it proved.
Indeed. And that does seem to be one of the really big geopolitical historic stories of our time, doesn't it?
Yes.
The alliance of autocracies, certainly non-democracies, that sometimes historically have had their differences, but do seem to more and more work closer and closer together. You mentioned China, Russia, Iran, we see other countries in the Middle East as well, against what they believe is a West and democratic world which is ailing and increasingly frail and fragile. We should be worried about that.
We should be worried about that.
But which country should we be more worried about? Russia? China? Both in different ways, in your view?
Well, I think they're very different. I think the Russians went to the Chinese, basically, and wanted to improve relations and struck deal, and it was a clever thing for Putin to do. But remember, in Ukraine, the Chinese said right from the start, we will not support any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and they should be given credit for that. That was a decision which was taken for wider purposes. I think the Chinese, having really relatively recently had sophisticated nuclear weapons, realized the danger to the world of them. And it's a massive danger. I spent a lot of my time, actually, on trying to reduce the dangers of nuclear weapons. And I think that China must be given credit for that big strategic decision, but it didn't change their support for Putin. And he has worked his way into a good relationship with China.
Are you one of these people who is more hawkish about China, or do you think that they ought to be, as Cameron did when he was Prime Minister, for example, don't know if he's changed his mind now he's Foreign Secretary, but that there is no avoiding China, that they need to be in some way brought into the fold, or at least we have a constructive dialogue with them?
I think there is still time to have a constructive dialogue with China, but it will mean politicians, when they make a decision like that, warning Putin you can't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, giving them credit for it. There's a slight danger at the moment, and I listen to the debate in British politics about China, is it's all negative. You only focus on what's going wrong. We have this huge problem about Taiwan, and that needs some very fast diplomacy to see if we can push it onto a less confrontational scale.
Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I do. It was difficult, but I believe it can be done. I think you have to shift opinion in Taiwan as well as in China. It's no use just thinking of China. Taiwan has to change. We have to have an accommodation. And it's much harder to do this because China went in and broke the treaty that Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher and over Hong Kong. So over Hong Kong, that was careless more than anything else.
But is it possible to have an accommodation if it's true that President Xi believes that eventual reintegration of Taiwan is part of China's historic destiny, and indeed part of his own destiny, as part of the pantheon of great Chinese leaders since Mao?
Well, you can understand why he thinks that it is. I mean, that's the nature of it. After all, they came to power through removing Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek went off to Taiwan, and it was dealt with, thought it would be dealt with later when he died and things like that. It took much longer, and Taiwan is going to be difficult to crack, but not impossible. I mean, you only get these deals if there's compromises made on both sides, and the question is, what are those compromises that each one has got to be delivered? You've got a leader now in Taiwan who is more robust. That could be an obstacle. It could be an advantage in that his robustness may hide also a more rational understanding of the weaknesses of the Taiwan position. And they are very weak, actually, in many respects, the arguments. But we've got to get away from Putin, Xi, and other people feeling that all they've got to do to assert their will is to use military power. But who do they get that from? And to a great extent, they get it from America and the US. I mean, after all, we invaded Iraq with no proper evidence that there were nuclear weapons.
You draw a line from the 2003 invasion, at least to some extent, to the militarism and the military adventures that we're seeing, the use of force as a means of international will.
Yes.
As we've seen it, but you draw a line between those two things, the Ukraine war and 2003.
I think it's still that lesson has not been learned. Well, certainly Tony Blair's never learned it. He keeps telling us he would do exactly the same. Well, I used to see him in those days, and I've got respect for his intelligence. And it was shocking for me to discover in one-on-one talks with him that he was totally convinced that Iraq had rediscovered, if you like, rebrought back nuclear weapons. There was no evidence for it in rational sense. They've been removed by the UN as a result of the humiliation fight. Now, of course, he didn't want the rest of the world to think that he had them removed because he had enemies all around him. But how Blair convinced himself that there were nuclear weapons is beyond me. The Americans never really made much of that. They weren't on other reasons why they attacked Iraq. Britain put itself on the wrong side of international law for about 7 or 8 years.
Just on Ukraine, it's a pivotal year for the war in Ukraine. Who do you think in the end is going to win, if any, either side?
It's very infrequent for a war to end in total victory. The victor pays a penalty as well as the person who's defeated. We need to understand that more. We need less war, period.
So
and then we'll have more rationality.
So do you think we should be trying to argue for an accommodation between the two sides? In Ukraine?
Zelensky is a great leader. He's had a very good innings. He's held back Russia in a quite remarkable way. But largely because we didn't give him some of the weapons that he needed, they have entrenched themselves on this current line, and this current line will be very difficult to break. We're told there's been initiative from Russia giving an indication to America that they would settle for where the line is now. Well, the Ukrainians must make that decision. I'm not going to ever tell them what to do. They were attacked. They've been extraordinarily brave and amazingly effective. All I would say to Zelensky, all politicians have to compromise in the end. That is the art of politics.
I mean, you were Foreign Secretary while the Cold War was still raging.
Yes.
You know how important the NATO alliance was, better than almost anybody. We are facing down the prospect of a second Trump presidency. He is less committed to the idea of NATO than ever. He said so just the other day. Do you think that's the thing we should be most worried about?
Well, I did get involved with Trump directly,
Really?
not person to person, but through his aides. And I tried to convince him that NATO would respond to his claim that we must spend more, because it was a correct claim.
Yeah.
And I think if I was still Foreign Secretary when he I have an American wife who's completely convinced that Trump is going to win.
She is?
Yes. I think the first thing somebody has to say to Trump, look, you were proven right. Now, only in the last few years, is NATO starting to pay its own bills. And you are not going to be facing inside a NATO alliance the unfairness that you saw before, in which you were paying the bills and they were taking the defence for not exactly free, but for. So you've won, basically, and we build up an image where Trump can say, my attitude to NATO was, they must spend more. They have now done that. I can live with the present NATO organisation. I don't think that's an impossible thing to sell, and we better send old Farage out there to persuade Trump.
You would do that if you were Foreign Secretary. Would you send Farage out there to try and persuade him?
Well, I think, yes, I would certainly. I hope it could be done without making him ambassador, but as some people have suggested, it's not totally outrageous suggestion.
Given they are so close?
Well, yes. I mean, I put somebody in, Peter Jay, into Washington because I wanted somebody who would influence the new Carter administration. Yeah. He did exactly that. Played tennis with Brzezinski and generally got himself in. And I had
He was a Secretary of State at that time.
Yeah. It was my suggestion to the Prime Minister to make it. It was not difficult. It was difficult for him because he was his son-in-law. But I think he did extremely well. He did the job. This was a completely new type of American politician, Carter, and he was, advocating human rights. He was on our agenda, and it helped greatly to have a young person who was obviously very close to the Foreign Secretary.
But as you say, I mean, you observe American politics closely. You have an American wife. Did you ever think you see the day, though, whatever we think about how the British government should interact with Trump, and NATO should, where an American presidential election could feel quite so existential, where American democracy itself, we saw this play out in 2020, could well see it play out again this year, where American democracy itself is so in question and in jeopardy?
Look, we've yet to come to this election. It's quite a way away. It is very dangerous if Democrats continue with Biden as president.
You think so?
We've got to be quite blunt about it. I like Biden. I think Biden has made some very sensible decisions. I've got no serious criticism with him. But the fact is, he doesn't have popular support. He's not going to win. And they have got to choose somebody like the governor of California.
Gavin Newsom.
Yes, young, able, effective. And Biden's got to step down. Now, nobody steps down from president voluntarily until they really have to. He's got a few more months. But he should say to the people, I'm getting a bit old, and the Democrat Party ought to have an open nomination conference and elect somebody who is more vigorous and will beat Trump. And Biden will say, well, I've beaten Trump once. Yes, you beat Trump once, but don't count on it.
Have you ever had any interactions with Biden?
I've always watched him as senator, and like he's
he would have been
a good social democrat.
Senate when you were Foreign Secretary. Yes.
Yeah, he's a good social democrat.
Yes.
Yeah, he liked Carter. He was one of the first senators to go down and see Carter.
What were your impressions of Carter when you were Foreign Secretary? What was he like?
Different, engaging, serious. Almost too serious. They say he used to run the rota of who used the tennis court in the White House. He couldn't give way on things, but he was a breath of fresh air. I was dealing with Africa big time because of Rhodesia, Sterling Rebellion and everything like that. Here you had an American president who was absolutely in principle against apartheid and prepared to take sanctions against South Africa. And we passed that threshold when he was president. And we would never have done it with any other American government.
And he and Callahan got on well, didn't they, I think?
Callahan and he got on very well, very well. Well, Jim was a very interesting figure, actually.
Callahan?
Yes. I was never a Callahanite. I was seen more as a Jenkinsite. Jenkins and I came apart over his wish to make the SDP a liberal party. But, Jenkins had a lot of skills and a lot of character.
Well, this is interesting. We should talk about your political career was an extraordinary one. You started as a Labour MP, became Foreign Secretary, youngest Foreign Secretary we've had since Anthony Eden. You were 38, I think, when you became Foreign Secretary when Tony Crosland died. And then, of course, you were instrumental in establishing, you left the Labour Party, part of the Gang of Four, you set up the Social Democratic Party, became leader eventually, had the split again. And you've always been a sort of unique political figure, I think, in many ways. And your longevity, therefore, is very long indeed. I mean, who were, during this time when you were in politics, who were your lodestars? Well, particularly when you were starting off in politics, who were your heroes? Who was
Hugh
inspiring you?
Gaitskell,
Gaitskell.
no question about that.
Yes.
Yes. And when I was an undergraduate, I began to see the wisdom of why he fought over retaining the nuclear weapons against the unilateralism, and also why he warned about Europe, that is a federal state.
You supported
I think
Brexit. What was the reason
seed
for that?
of federalism, being inherent in the European Union, was sown in my mind by a Gaitskell stand. Then I fought it all the way through. I said I formed an organisation called Yes to Europe, No to the Euro. Once you went in for the Euro, it was inevitable.
But you were in favour in '75 in the Common Market referendum. You were in favour.
I was in favour of the Common Market. It seemed to me a very sensible thing. You've got a market on your doorstep. I was reluctant to come out until it was so obvious that it was going to lead to a federal state. I remember seeing Henry Kissinger when the thing was really on, the referendum, and I went to see him, and he said to me, "David, what do you think about it?" And I said what I wanted. And then he said a very interesting thing. I don't want to live in a world where there is not an independent British voice in foreign policy.
Kissinger said that to you?
Kissinger said that to me. And he was damn right.
How do you think Brexit is going?
Ask me in 100 years' time. It's a historic choice. We left Rome 1,000 years ago. We've left it again. And I don't say it jokingly, because some people have suffered. I think the evidence is piling up that it's doing better than some people predicted. The people, in their judgment, and in my view, good judgment, overrode those warnings of doom. But the warnings contained some truth in it. After all, if you go away from your nearest market, and you don't have to jump trade barriers, that's difficult. And you've got to get gains elsewhere. But, take one of the things we already see. Now, Britain has had tilted back towards the Pacific, and we are a world power again, a small power, but a world power. We're in the Pacific. We are taken into account by countries who can help our trading and improve our market share.
I wonder whether you supported it, because the one thing about you, I think, throughout your whole political career that many people would have said about you is you are quite a bullish person. You're someone who has self-confidence, but also likes to see confidence in others. I noted that you wrote, I think in your memoir, you said, I became suspicious during Suez of a kind of automatic sogginess which you come across in many aspects of British life. I suppose it underlay the appeasement years. Its modern equivalent is a resigned attitude to Britain's continuous post-war economic decline. Do you think that sogginess is still there in British life?
Yes.
It's a characteristic of British political life.
No, I don't believe it's a characteristic. It's we're soggy right up to we have a breaking point, and then we stand and fight. We've got a long way to go, but I believe we are penetrating these world markets. I believe we are taken into account by countries like Korea, Japan, and of course the US, because they like having us there with them, dealing with China and Russia. So I think we're back in big global politics, but we're still too weak economically. We've got to catch up, and there was always going to be a problem in the immediate years of leaving the European community. We've made some compromises with the European. I wouldn't have come out on these ridiculous terms that were forced on.
You think they were ridiculous?
The
Johnson terms?
Yes. It wasn't really. Johnson took them up, but they had these crazies. We had no proper parliament, really, for a whole series of times, and idiots seeming to want to move out of already existing markets as if it was a matter of no concern.
Yes.
I would have come out on Norway terms, if frankly.
Single market?
Yeah. I mean, all I wanted was to be a self-governing country. The problem was this getting under the European Court of Justice, and we're seeing it now with the
Yes.
European Court of Human Rights.
What do you-
I think we will have to come out of it, unfortunately. I hope not. But if they go on making ludicrous interventions in our immigration policy...
You think we might have to withdraw from the ECHR?
Yes, I mean, because they are telling us how to conduct our immigration policy. And they're using powers, incidentally, that have never been used before.
They are doing so under treaties that we have voluntarily signed up to.
Yes, but they've taken new powers in to deal with our immigration thing. They've never been used before. And it's like all these human rights and lawyers things. You give lawyers a yard, they'll take a mile. That's the nature of the game.
So you think the
You've
Rwanda
got to
plan...
keep your lawyers very strongly under control.
You think the government's Rwanda plan is sensible or good idea?
You shouldn't have to do it, is the honest answer. But you have got to do something about immigration. And there's a very serious problem for this country. I mean, the people will not put up with it. We're back into a situation of Enoch Powell when he made immigration a major issue and very nearly split the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party could well fight the next election split. It's not unsure whether Sunak can hold them together. If he fights with a split Tory party, then we will end eventually the domination of two-party system: Labour, Conservative, Labour, Conservative, 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 Labour.
So you think the Conservative Party might split either before the election or afterwards?
They're openly advocating it. And there is a group of them now who've got an issue, which is immigration, which is a popular issue, and they could well push it. And so this party that is being talked of at the moment is very possibly will come into existence. At that juncture, then will come into existence a challenge to the whole of the structure of British politics. Why should we go on with Labour Conservative? It's been bloody awful.
Well, you tried. You gave it
very badly governed.
You gave it a very good go, but it still snapped back in the end.
It snapped back. We didn't make it, and the break has got to come in one of the major parties. If it comes in the Tory party, we can eventually create a structure. Proportional representation was always jeered at and things. We've now got it in Scotland, and it works. We've got it in London, and it works. We've got it in Wales, and it works. So the argument against proportional representation is busted. There should have been 30, 40 Greens in the British Parliament now, given the strength of the opinion about the greenery. And look at all the other issues which are unrepresented in this strange polarisation between Labour and Conservatives. It's a rotten system. We tried with the SDP. Incidentally, there's a new SDP party to vote for. Good for them. Choice. We need more people who are ready to bust the system. And I think it's going to happen if the Tories split on immigration. And Sunak's policy is, the criticisms against it are pretty strong, you know.
What do you make of Keir Starmer and what he's done with the Labour Party?
Well, my problem with Starmer is he's a nice character. I once had a meal with him and his wife, who's a very nice person. I've got no problem with him in terms of personality. But I have a problem with a man who comes into Parliament, works under Corbyn, and takes on the main role of trying to stop the referendum decision being passed by the House of Commons. That's not the role of a Democrat. You may not want the referendum, you certainly don't like the result, but to try to use Parliament, as Starmer led that, during this time when poor old Theresa May couldn't get anything through, Parliament couldn't decide anything, they were effectively trying to block and call for a second referendum, which was, of course, blocking. That's what they were doing. It was a disgraceful period in British politics, and Starmer was in it up to his neck.
But do you think he's been an impressive leader of the opposition? Do you think he'd be a good Prime Minister?
Well,
you've seen lots of Prime Ministers up close.
I don't like his record, so I have a reservation there. I look at people what they do, not what they say. And I think that's a good rule in politics. We all say lots of things. But what are you actually bloody well doing? The Labour Party is a very strange coalition. It gives the appearance at the moment of being very united, but none of the tough decisions that Starmer talks about have been actually introduced.
Lord Owen, you clearly haven't lost any of your zeal, your passion for politics. You've had, as I say, this extraordinary political career, but it must have been quite lonely being David Owen over the course of your career, because you ended up, I always think of you in a way, I always think maybe if we'd had a presidential system, you might have been quite a candidate for president or ended up as president. But in a way, you sort of always sat uncomfortably, it seems to me, in the party system. You're a sort of party of one. I mean, even in this interview today, your views are fascinating and informed, but they are eclectic. They don't map neatly onto any particular constellation, ideology, or even party. That's been the story of your career, hasn't it? Have you ever?
Yes, that's why, of course, I thought that the two parties were not system were failing.
If you were a young man now, starting out again, would you still go into politics, do you think?
I went into politics because I was a doctor looking after a children's ward in central London, just 100 yards from St Thomas's, part of St Thomas's Hospital. And I was admitting people to hospital, not because of the illness, children particularly, but because there was no lavatory in the house and you had to go down the garden, that there was absolutely sordid housing conditions and overcrowding. For social reasons, we were dictating a lot. Now, much of that has changed. The housing situation is still not marvellous. But I felt at that time that you weren't going to change it by just carrying on being a doctor, and I was tempted by politics. But I'll tell you an amusing story.
Go on.
I fought a hopeless seat in Torrington, North Devon. You'd never get in. I saved my deposit. Then I was asked to stand in my own seat.
In Plymouth.
And at a select conference, the short list was Betty Boothroyd and David Owen. And I beat her. And at the end of it, some women came up to me and said, "You didn't make anywhere near as good a speech as Betty Boothroyd." And I said, "Why do you vote for me?" "Oh, we're patients of your father." I was a Plymouthian. And despite all Betty's skills as a speaker, they wanted one of their own. We've let this link between somebody who's born in their constituency, knows the people and represents them in Parliament. When I left the Labour Party, I was supported by Plymouth throughout. I was the SDP MP twice in elections. We have got to reassess this idea of putting all the great and the good who can't win in normal seats and get pushed into safe Tory seats or safe Labour seats, and they have no relationship whatsoever with their people.
But do you think you would do it again? Go into politics again today if you were a young man?
Oh, I don't know. There's so many other things to do. You're not fair question.
Well, that's
I can't, and I won't.
But you don't regret your life in politics?
I don't regret anything.
You could have stayed as a country doctor.
It's foolish to say how do you regret. At the time, you take a calculated decision to what you're going to do. I absolutely love medicine. I would enjoy being Minister of Health far more than being Foreign Secretary.
Really?
Yes.
You could have been Minister of Health during COVID.
Well, I would hope to have handled it damn sight better than it was handled. I think that I had a wonderful time there. I made changes and I can still see walking around. And I worked very hard on a wonderful team. The civil servants were totally committed to the National Health Service. They worked long hours, endless effort. Barbara Castle was a good boss. It was the Department of Health and Social Security, what we called the Department of Stealth and Total Obscurity. And she was more interested in pensions, so she let me be, I was effectively Minister of Health.
And if you, from all of these people that you've met, politicians, maybe national, international, who's the most impressive political figure you've ever met?
I never met Hugh Gaitskell.
No.
If you ask me who's the person I most profoundly approve of, right across the board of politics and policy, I think he's an excellent Chancellor of Exchequer in very difficult times in the Labour government. I think his courage in fighting against unilateralism, his courage in fighting for a proper view of Europe and not being taken away, I think he's the man I admired most.
And if you were to, finally, if you were to give any advice to someone listening, got a lot of young people listening, very interested in politics, thinking of going into politics, what would your advice be to them?
Build a base, choose a constituency that you either have got a relationship with, but build it from the ground up so that you're chosen by that constituency because they know you don't waft in. And if you can tie your constituency and if you can rely on your constituency, then you can be courageous and you can challenge things and you can come back and be supported by them. I was never, ever let down by Plymouth. I had very small majorities. It was a tough seat to keep, but there's no doubt I was kept because I was one of them.
Lord Owen, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.